Everybody see it? Okay, there's the recording button.
Yes.
Jim's retired man to be on later, but that the test, Lawrence, again, you have the time to do that. And so whenever, you're not graduating, are you?
I am.
This time?
I am.
Ooh. Well, I may have to give you just do what you can on that. Then I didn't think he was graduating because I kind of fixed it. So like if you some of those questions, it says like discuss Socrates, what Socrates gave to contribute to the philosophy. And what I really wanted you to do is go down and make the points that he, in reference to that, fix it like if he was going to use it for an introduction to a sermon about philosophy or something like that. But if since you're graduating, if you can't do it that way, just answer them. And some of those questions you can answer with like a 2 or 3 words or a sentence. That'd be just fine. But on those discussions, I wrote a little note on there. And, I didn't know you were graduating, so you'll have to have a grade. Well, are you graduating Saturday?
I am. Matter of fact, at 10:30, I'm on a 10:30 roster.
Oh, okay. Well, I won't be here. I have to carry my wife out of town. She has AFib, and so I have to drive. What about this? Do you need this grade to graduate?
I don't think I need this one.
Oh, okay. Okay. If you do, I can give your first test grade as your grade, and we can change it if it goes down, or if it goes up, whichever one it may be. Okay, we got down to talking about Cyprus, and we were talking about, we started last week about family life in Antioch, Syria. Today we'll start about family life in Cyprus. And then next week we'll look at the background of Acts, the book of Revelation, look at just some things. Again, look at the manners and the customs, all those things that we've learned thus far. And see if we can't make some sense, I guess, out of what Mr. Bale and Brother Ferguson have said in their books about these places and how things work. Let's have a word of prayer. Eternal Father, again, we're thankful for today and for all the blessings of life. We're thankful, Father, that we can come together as our children and study from thy word. We're thankful for the Georgia School of Preaching and all those that are involved in that. We ask thy blessings upon the school and upon our students as they study. We pray, Father, that things will continue to go well for us. Pray, Father, for those who are sick, those, Father, who have lost loved ones, and all that's our duty to pray for. We especially pray, Father, for the people of Venezuela. We pray, Heavenly Father, for our brethren there that are going through all the things they're going through. And we pray, Father, that we'll be able to do some things for them as things may, we pray that things will get better and we'll be able to help them in every way. Watch over us and keep us close to thee. In Jesus' name, amen. Has anybody heard from any of the brethren from Venezuela? I haven't seen anything on the internet about them, and so it kind of concerns me about our brethren over there. Okay, so if anybody sees anything about them in reference to even later on, say for instance, the fellow leaves, the dictator leaves, and they start things, and we find things that our brethren are in need of, we always try to contribute at the Convertible Church of Christ to some of that. So most of y'all have my email address, and if you find something other or some congregation where you attend, or you know somebody that's trying to collect money or things of that sort for them, if you'll let us know so that we can also contribute, we'd appreciate that. Okay, we're talking about the family life and that of the Cyprus. And remember now, Cyprus is basically an island. It is an island, and basically it just has like one big road. They have small roads, but they have that one like a big circle around it. Then it has on up to that of the point that reference to Cyprus. But the family life, families in Cyprus live basically the same as we saw in Antioch, Syria, and also in the area of Palestine. That is at least in reference that we talk about how that they lived among the Jewish people. And we would find that families, again, would arrange that of the marriages for their families, and the bride's family provided a dowry, and the groom would make a gift to the bride, and the midwives commonly assisted in the birthing process. And so male Jews were circumcised as the sons of the covenant. Purification, dietary laws were at least partially followed because of the proximity to Palestine and the relative ease of travel. Many went to Jerusalem for Passover, and we have to remember, if they went to the land there, it's anywhere from 40, I think it's 43 miles to 64 miles. They could go by ship, and it didn't take long to get there, but then they'd have to travel down to that of Jerusalem. And so they could go to Jerusalem from time to time, and they always would send their annual half shekel tax for the support of the temple. When I thought about that, I think about the Memphis School of Preaching, which I'm a graduate of. They just sent me a note and said that our dues went up. So when they started Georgia School of Preaching alumni, y'all had to have dues, see? And you'll have to have this annual half shekel tax on them. But they weaned their infants at about 2 years of age, and the mothers saw to early care and upbringing of their children. Again, the fathers took over the training of the boys, like we talked about in Antioch, and later on they prepared them to become the adult sons of the law, that is the law of Moses, and to follow their occupations. And so there was little consideration, as with us, of the various employment options that were available to them, but the synagogue provided some educational opportunities, at least in a Sabbath school of learning the law. Now, since we find that Cyprus is not, they have a synagogue, is that synagogue was used also for other studies that they would do. By the end of the century, the first century, this began to include more like formal and more extensive education, because it was a central place for the Jewish people to come anyway, and so they made, you could also do other things there. I remember, I think it was right after the Korean War ended, that I went to a new school called Cloverleaf up in Carswell, and since that time they've built another building somewhere else. But Cloverleaf School was used for that of the veterans that were getting out of the military to take classes. Some of them did not have high school education, and so forth. They could get a high school education, and plus they could train them to work in the carpet mills and Goodyear Tire and Rubber and places like that. Well, that's what they did there at the synagogue. They would use that to help train the people. And so by the New Testament times, everyone on the island spoke Greek, though at home families often spoke Aramaic. The common language was that of the Koine Greek, and so that's what most of them would speak. The Koine Greek is very specific in reference to what you're trying to say. It's just like we say, I love you, and yet they had 4 words for the word love. They had 3 that's used in the Bible. And so they had words to refer to that of love, and so they were very specific. But then we notice, because the reason we're using Cyprus is because Cyprus is away from the mainland, as we would think about the mainland. And so we wanted to use them to maybe look at some other things like, they go to the island, so where did they stay? So like someone told me today that they had gone to Key West. Now, I've never been to Key West. Some of you may have. Maybe I talked my wife into letting us take our travel trailer down there and stay in it. And next Thursday, or it's our last day, and on Friday we're going to a campground for a week. But they had to find accommodations. And again, like we've already learned in reference to that a lot of people had extra rooms in their houses and so forth. But here they're on an island. So where did Barnabas and the company find the accommodations, the food, and laundry facilities as they travel? Because those are the things that we look for too, especially if we're traveling in a travel trailer or RV or something like that. We look, and even now, when we go to motels, most of them have laundry places. They have food. If you want to pay $3 for a $1 Coca-Cola, then you can do that at most Holiday Inn places, Holiday Inn Express. And so we would find that that they would have to find places to stay. Now remember though that we made this reference to that of Joseph when we talked about Jesus and as they were traveling where he was born. Remember, Joseph and Mary actually were from, or Joseph was from that area. And so here Barnabas is from this area. Now Luke reports on their going about from place to place, but it writes nothing about where they stayed and how they met their personal needs. We don't find anything as we look at Acts chapter 11 and other places that here they went to Cyprus, but nothing is given to us any insight whatsoever in reference to what was going on. In the first place, they were sent by the Antioch church. Now, evidently, they carried funds for their support. Now, since they were sent there, and the church would be, if the church is existing there, they may be carrying funds for the church. And not only that, but it's like probably some of us is that, congregations, when people, we would send people, we'd always have the arrangements made. When I went over to Latvia, the arrangements were made. I stayed with a member of the church. We had a Nigerian lady come, and she was pregnant. And she was coming. She had family living in South Carolina, North Carolina, and she was going over there. But they began to search, and they found out that she could give birth to the baby in Cartersville at the Cartersville Medical Center cheaper than any place else in the United States. I don't know how that is, but that's what it was. And she showed up one Sunday morning. This car pulled up. She gets out. She's pregnant. And she gets out with a suitcase and everything, and they leave. And we took her in. She stayed with one of our elders and his wife, and they had a daughter to go to college, and so she stayed there, and she gave birth over in Cartersville, and they stayed here for a little while, and then they went back, and they've been back to see us, and we check on them all the time from Nigeria because they're having all kinds of problems. But yet, the arrangements were made. Well, we don't know what kind of arrangements were made, but secondly, they were inns or places where businessmen and government agents could stay. I asked someone about Key West, and they said, oh, yeah, they have motels and everything down there. They have campgrounds down there, too. So thirdly, the Oriental or Mediterranean hospitality was practiced from the earlier times to the present. The Old Testament has accounts of perfect strangers being entertained in the home from Abraham's day onward. Fourth of all, Barnabas had owned property on Cyprus and presumably still had relatives and possibly even property on the island. You remember he sold that. Fifth, by the time the trio landed there were converts, the persecuted preachers, Acts 11 and verse 19, and who would probably receive them. Six, there were their own converts or others who might receive them into their homes. And so Jesus himself had given them instructions to the itinerant evangelists about staying in a private home in Matthew chapter 10, 11 through 13. They were supposed to stay there and so forth, and people would take care of them. That would be the 70 when they were sent out. So the Jews buried their dead rather than cremating them, and as Romans commonly did. The wealthy might afford mausoleums or family tombs and caves, but the majority buried their dead in the town cemetery. And so that would just tell us, by doing that, that they had a town cemetery on Cyprus. So we don't know the type of accommodations that were made, but again, hospitality, and we'll find that, the Bible deals with that elders in the church, they're supposed to be hospitable and so forth. And in my lifetime, as long as I've been a member of the church and I obeyed the gospel, Linda and I did September the 24th, 1970, I heard of a preacher. That's the only person I ever heard of that made a public confession about didn't show hospitality. And that had a family there that come there and nobody, he left. He didn't stay to see if they were taken care of or didn't ask them to go to eat, go come spend the time with them or whatever. And I was actually there. That's the following day to pick up some stuff to help some people, and someone was telling about how that he had made a confession, public confession, and told others that they needed to be more hospitable, and so that would probably be true for the church throughout the world. Then about work and travel and commerce, I think when we was talking about Syria, we separated all those, but here during the New Testament period, Cyprus was a thriving, prosperous province. They had many employment opportunities, as we've indicated, in connection with that of agriculture. The farms produced adequate supplies of wheat and oats and abundance of high qualities olives and grapes, which they would make wine and honey. Now, honey was one of those things because of the bees. We've already made reference to that. It was one of the things that people so desired to have because of its sweetness and things of that sort. And not everybody had honeybees. But more important to the Cyprus economy was their mining. And they had related industries that also in reference to that of the mining. And so, in fact, the copper of Cyprus had become the predominant metal for the Eastern Mediterranean bronze industries, and so that of Syria to Sardinia from about 1300 BC on. So the implication is that the people of Cyprus, they shipped only refined copper in the forms of ingots. That's what INGOTS. And I think I told you about going through up at Grand Canyon. We rode the train up there around Sedona, and they went through the area where they mined copper, and it was just amazing to look at copper on rocks, you know. And then if you're ever up in Cartersville, if you ever come up there, we have that museum up there, and they'll tell you right fast it's millions and millions of years that them rocks are being made, and they'll show you all the products they make from rocks and stuff that found there in Bartow County. And so toothpaste and everything else you can think of that they make with all that kind of stuff. And so if you ever want to go up there to the Mineral Museum. But they also had an extensive iron industry, thrived on the island. A few of the iron products were shipped in finished form, but were made to order by local smiths. And so their smiths, that is their blacksmiths, they produce weapons of special renown in the Hellenistic period. The miners also exploited lead and gold and silver and gypsum and resources during that of New Testament time. So it was a mineral-rich island. Now, since they had to carry, ship stuff out, then there would be the shipbuilding served as another important industry on Cyprus. An early Roman historian commented that Cyprus was capable of producing everything required to build and equip a ship. Even though forests were being depleted during the first century, depletion resulted from extensive use of the wood for smelting and clearing the land for cultivation. And so that's what they used. Most likely, if they stayed into that of the ship building business, then they'd have to import, wood from elsewhere. The commerce flowed in reference to the routes between Cyprus and Syria and Asia Minor and points west. And the freighters that carried official government cargoes during the first century were commonly about 340 tons. And those of the Roman grain fleet ran to about 1,200 tons and were sometimes almost 200 feet long. And so generally during ships of the period carried a square sail, above which was a top sail, and at least a few oars for emergency or auxiliary work. And so that simply meant if they had those oars and everything, that they'd have people on there also, to be the ones who would do that kind of work. And most of the time they would have slaves to do that, and sometimes they had free people that did that. But some of the freighters were designed to be driven by sail and rowers together, and so the merchantmen were fairly beam to beam ratio of 4 to 1 was common, and the freighters generally had a cabin and also a deck and big enough for the captain of all of his mates. And yet they would also carry passengers, and we've probably seen when we watch movies and stuff that, where they'd be a cargo ship, but also they would have that of passengers, and that's what they did. And so, such as we had there of Barnabas and Paul and John Mark, they are, Paul, Silas, and Timothy. John Mark and Barnabas had already left, if I've got it straight. But if they wanted privacy, a lot of time the passengers would go, but they lived and they slept on the deck. If they wanted some privacy, they might erect a tent like a shelter behind the cabin, so forth, and it generally carried high and finished off in the shape of a goose head, they would say. But depending on what was available, the ship makers would use pine and fir and cedar for planks of the hull, and inside they use any kind of wood, preferred fir for oars because of its light weight. But they made sails chiefly from that of linen, and the ropes were made from that of flax and the hemp and the papyrus, and sometimes even from that of leather. And so they often achieved the underwater surface of the hull with sheet lead and placing a layer of a tarred fabric between the hull and the lead. They painted the ships in bright fashions with purple, blue, white, yellow, and green, unless they were pirates or reconnaissance vessels, in which they might use a shade that matched the seawater and serve as that of camouflage. And so as to speed, they could go about 6 knots. So the journey of the missionaries between Seleucia and Salamis on Cyprus would have taken 24 hours. With a favorable wind, 24 hours. Is about 80 miles from the Seleucia to the eastern tip of Cyprus, and another 50 along the southern shoreline to that of Salamis. And so the ships of the early Roman Empire well built, and they were equipped with what we would call charts to plot the courses. And so a lead line to test that of depths, and they had flags to send out of messages, you know, how they would do on the sides and everything, send messages to that of people. And then also they had a ship boat, usually pulled behind for emergencies, and an anchor, but they didn't carry a compass. The lack of a compass, along with the fear of winter storms, dictated a sailing season between March and November in that of the Mediterranean. So the point is that in the Mediterranean, the skies are clear enough in the summer to permit mariners to sail by sun, star, and landmark. But goods were carried on these ships from Syria to Cyprus to points west, almost defied that of tabulation. There was the luxury goods, that is, you know, the things that would come from the east. There would be the silk route from China, determined in Syria just across the water from Cyprus. And the dyes and the finished goods of Syria would move west in quantity, often in the Cyprus bottoms. And so we find the copper, the iron, the olive oil, and the wines, and more than Cyprus flowed west in increasing quantities to satisfy the market. And so the markets of Asia Minor and also Italy. And so this is the way that they would send their products out. The people of Cyprus, now again, it's we said like an island, business people journeyed to points east and west, while the Jews of Cyprus actually sailed to Palestine on a pilgrimage. Barnabas was one of those, Acts 4 and verse 36. And there were also others, Acts 11 and verse 20, that came from Cyprus. But missionaries also traveled to Cyprus to convert the inhabitants to Christianity. So there were persecuted Christians, for example, that journeyed to Cyprus after persecution broke out in Jerusalem. We find in Acts 11, verse 19. Going back to Acts chapter 8 there in verse 1, it says they were scattered abroad. It tells us, you know, places that they went. But in Acts 11, verse 19, we find that they do go to Cyprus. So then came Barnabas and Saul and John Mark. That's right a while ago. I said Timothy, but it's Barnabas, Saul, and John Mark. In Acts chapter 14 is when I think it's John Mark turns back. So after traveling about on Cyprus for some months, Paul and his party embarked to go to Paphos and headed for Asia Minor coast, about 180 miles away, Acts 13:13, from that point. They had a favorable wind, and so they could have made the journey in a little more than a day. What they found, we're going to see in our next lesson, which is right now when we go to Asia Minor. And we talk about the book of Acts, the book of Ephesus, Ephesians, and also the book of Revelation. And so we'll see how that we can, again, put things together and how that the gospel went on those three missionary journeys as they would go. And also we'll talk about Ephesus, Acts chapter 19, the book of Ephesians, and also Revelation chapter 2, it talks about the Ephesian people. One of the things is sometimes we talk about trying to, you know, put the Bible together and to learn things. And Ephesus, the church at Ephesus, the Ephesians, brethren, we have that visit in Acts 19. Then we have the epistle that Paul wrote while he was in the Roman jail. But also we have John telling us about the church at Ephesus. And so it's interesting because we can see that, like in Acts chapter 20, Paul warned them, the church at Ephesus, the elders who came over to Miletus. He warned them. And then we find in the book of Revelation chapter 2 that what he warned them about came to pass. And so, you know, we can see the stages of that, of the growth of the church at Ephesus, then we can see the downfall. And yet we find that Jesus points out to them that if they don't straighten themselves up, he's going to take out the candlestick. In other words, the light's going to be gone. It will no longer be the church. And the same is true today with the church. If we're a congregation of God's people and we begin to do the things that man wants to do instead of doing the things the Bible tells us to do, then we cease to be the church. It's like sometimes, I don't know if y'all travel, and that's never happened to me, but I've heard people tell me that they've traveled and they've gone up north. We were warned in 1973 when I was in school at Memphis, you know, that when you go up north that you make sure that you call before you go to a congregation, because you have people called up there, the Church of Christ, and some of them, if you pull up to their driveway, they'll have a sign that says upon disciples of Christ. So they're the instrumental group. But now we have in areas of the the Church of Christ, and they don't have that, and you walk in and they have instruments, or sometimes they have 2 or 3 different types of service, you know, the traditional service, the modern service, and some other kind of service. But if you look at Acts 13 through 14, and it says, now when Paul and his party sailed from Paphos, they came to Perga in Pamphylia, where when they departed from Perga, they came to Antioch in Pisidia, and went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and sat down. Now, we studied about Antioch in Syria, but there's also Antioch in Pisidia. And a lot of times we get them mixed up. I was going to say a lot of people do, but Bobby does too. We get them mixed up, but the one in Syria was the one that began to send out to have missionaries like Paul and Barnabas and John Mark and so forth and Silas, and they would go out and preach and teach the gospel in missionary efforts. But it was a beautiful sight. That is, when you stop and you think about Attala, the arms of the breakwater of Attala, and the port stretched wide to welcome Paul and his party as they sailed slowly toward the dock for the invasion of the Asian Minor with gospel. And so we'll find the term Asia is mentioned in those areas. He's talking about Asia Minor. He's not talking about what we think about Asia, you know, Russia and all that. He's talking about Asia Minor. And so along the coast on both sides of the town, the mountains soar up to a tire about after, the amber-colored tier, and then clothed in a forest of leaves, woods and greens and olive green, and the sea sweeping their feet. We don't know what they expected as they approached the shore, because this was, again, a new place that they were going. I think that it's good for us, if you have your New Testament, if you'll turn over to Acts chapter 2 before we go any further. Remember remember the Old Testament, as you read the Old Testament, that the Jewish people were scattered abroad. And we find that in Acts chapter 2, if you'll notice, he says, now, here they are in Acts chapter 2. Let's see here. It says in verse 8, and how hear we every man in our own tongue wherein we were born? He says, Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, and dwellers of Mesopotamia, and in Judea, and Cappadocia, and Pontus, and Asia. There's Asia. Now notice he says, Phrygia and Pamphylia, in Egypt, in the parts of Libya, about Cyrene, strangers of Rome, Jews, and proselytes, Cretes, and Arabians. We do hear them speak in our tongues the wonderful works of God. So those people that were scattered, and then here we notice this, that here they're coming along this coast. And they had, as the Bible pointed out, they sailed from Paphos, and they came to Perga in Pamphylia. When they departed from Perga, they came to Antioch in Pisidia and went into the synagogue. So the Jews were there. In other words, there were people that was back in the dispersion that came to that area, and so they were there. And most likely they would find, because of what Acts 2 says, and because everybody had come down for that the Pentecost, and so people obeyed the gospel, and they'd go back home and they'd preach and teach the gospel as well as they knew how to teach and preach the gospel. And so we don't know what they expected, but like I said, Paul had spent his early years in Tarsus in Southeast Asia Minor, but he had not been to that region. So in fact, Paul and his companions were not really interested in Attala, nor in Perga, about 12 miles northwest of Attala. Instead, they traveled 100 miles north of Perga to Antioch of Pisidia. So they just traveled through that area. So now why Paul would have gone there seems fairly obvious when we look at this, at his strategy of the missions and the position of that of Antioch. He worked longest in fairly large and strategic centers with a mobile population in centers that could act as a springboard, as we would say, for the rapid spread of the gospel. Now, Corinth and Ephesus will illustrate that strategy. When we think about Attala, we think about Corinth. And so we find that Antioch was a main stop, when you look at the map, on the great eastern trade route from Ephesus to the Euphrates. And so the Seleucids had established the city in the 3rd century BC to strengthen their hold on the native tribes and to spread the Hellenistic culture in the Phrygian area. So more recently, the Romans had used it as a chief center for the pacification of the southern Galatia. And so, moreover, it was located in a fertile valley as at the natural center of that of the district. And so that was the reason. So, but yet there were still some dangers that lurked in that area of Perga, Pisidia, and between Perga and Antioch when Paul came through on the first missionary journey. Now, sometimes we stop and we think of that. Paul had the trek to through that of Pisidia in mind when he made his autobiographic comments about perils of robbers in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 26. And most times, sometimes when we read commentaries, they'll talk about this is where a lot of this took place. But scholars have suggested that the dangers in the future missionary activities to the north of Perga is what caused John Mark to leave the other two and return to Jerusalem. Now, again, that they suggest that. There's no proof of that. And for that reason, Paul refused to take John Mark with him in Acts chapter 13 on his second missionary journey. Acts 13:13, then back in Acts chapter 15 after the Jerusalem Council when they went on the second missionary journey. But of course, there is no way of knowing whether either one of those suppositions is correct. But if we were to just say, maybe this, because we could understand that would be true because of the area. It could be true. He was afraid, and therefore, because of all the robbers and so forth, and even it was very known, even over in Jerusalem area, in reference to the road to Jericho, that there are robbers there, because all we have to do is read Luke chapter 10 about the Good Samaritan and so forth, that we find there are robbers on those highways. And so, in any case, when Paul and Barnabas entered into the region, they launched the message of the gospel into an area that dwarfs Cyprus, Palestine, Syria, or even the Nile Valley. Asia Minor had an area of approximately 200,000 square miles, and it was equal to the New England, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and West Virginia, approximately the entire northeastern United States. Now, I'm glad to hear that, because my wife and I sometimes between now and probably our next semester during the summer months that we want to visit those places, but we want to go up one more state and go to Maine. I don't know if we'll get to do that, just according to how her health is, but that's what we plan to do. And so you can see how big of an area, 200,000 square miles. So when we look at the land, Asia Minor, again, if you look, is the general geographical term for the peninsula that forms the bulk of modern Turkey today. And so it's not used in the New Testament times. Descriptive seems to have arisen about the 5th century AD. Anatolia commonly applied to that part of the peninsula west the Halys River, but is frequently used virtually as a synonym for Asia Minor. So Asia Minor is bounded on the north by the Black Sea, on the west by the Aegean, and also the Straits of Bosphorus and Dardanelles, on the south by the Mediterranean Sea, and on the east by the line running northeastward from the Gulf of Iskenderun to Euphrates and up to the river of Kora River, and then back to the Black Sea. And so that shows us the area. If we were to be taking Bible geography, that's what they would tell us about the area. But the mass of the Asian Minor is a plateau about 3,000, 5,000 feet above seawater or sea level, tilted down toward the north and west. There's extensive and irregular. This plateau is fringed on all sides by higher mountain range, but on the west, the hills are fewer and less imposing. So while the plateau consists largely of rolling upland and highlands and numerous sunken basins occupied by lakes and marshes that add variety to the place, but today rivers in and into the interior plains from the adjoining mountains flow into the salt lakes and into the swamps. But in the New Testament times, farmers used the waters for irrigation, and city dwellers, numerous large cities depended on them for water. So that tells us that they either dug channels or they had a way to get the water there in some way or another. And so erosion had been cut deeply into the surface of the northern part of the plateau. And so in many places there are steep valley walls and rugged hillsides. But they had to have the water because, again, the rainfall was not that high in those areas, which we had talked about earlier. Then you had the Taras mountains there. as a whole, the central plateau had slender resources because of its enclosed nature, and so much of the plateau is arid. It supported little plant or animal life and is used for grazing of that of sheep. Not until the Hellenistic and the Roman periods did the town life begin to develop. Even then, the larger towns were strung out along the edge rather than around the heart of the tableland, and so the middle part of the plateau had never produced an important coordinating center, as some people would think. But you look at the mountain ranges, and as we've already noted, the central plateau is surrounded by mountain ranges. The Armenian Mountains extended westward and forward near the eastern boundaries of the peninsula into two ranges, the Taurus on the south of the mountains of the Pontus on the north, and the northern rim of the mountains rise to about 8,000 feet and the southern to 10,000 feet. So both consist of a series of overlapping ridges, which permitted only a few narrow passages between the coast and the interior. In the east and northeast of the main Taurus system, and parallel to it lied the anti-Taurus range. And so along the southern edge of the plateau groups of volcanic peak rise of a distance of about 150 miles. And so at the northeast end of this range stands Mount, if I can say this, I can't say it. Eric, it's Erciyas, Dougie, D-A-G-I, and it's called the ancient Argaeus, at the height of 13,100 feet, the highest point in Asia Minor. Now, here in the western Cappadocia, fertilized by lava dust and supplied with snow winters in the summer, or that's where we would find these fine orchards, and they would find the best horse pastures of the Near East. So on them grazed a strain of racehorses bred for the Roman circus. And so from Phrygia, on the west of the central plateau, extended three mountain ranges, which delimited the valleys of Caicus and Gades and also Menderes. Since these valleys run east and west, they naturally conduct traffic in those directions. And so the only open face of Asia Minor is toward the west and northwest, where the plateau ends in a staircase down to a Piedmont country. Since the western shore is easily accessible, most invasions of Asia Minor that had any lasting results had been launched from Europe, that is, from the Phrygians, the Greeks, and the Galatians, the Gauls. And so this is some of the things that took place there in reference to that. Then we have the Cilician Gates, as imitated the mountains of Asia Minor, constitute these barriers, and but there are strategic passes within that area. So the most important was, of course, the Cilician Gates north of Tarsus. Two passes made possible routes from Attala to Laodicea. Now, again, remember Laodicea is the church that's mentioned also in the book of Revelation, and to the Pisidian Antioch. Another gave passage from Seleucia in western Cilicia to Caraman in the interior. So one other gave access between Cappadocia and eastern Cilicia. So we see, how they could get around. The mountains might and did constitute hindrances to communication and transportation, but they provided sources of mineral wealth. Since Asia Minor is significant in biblical narrative during the Roman times, only a statement of minerals known and mined then is provided. During the Roman times, the gold of Asia Minor had been depleted, and miners still dug a little silver in Pontus and some in the central Cappadocia, and they produced some copper from other areas like Chalcedon and also in Pontus and Cilicia. But how many of the abandoned copper pits I had all over the country worked in the Romans' time is not known, but iron came chiefly from Pontus and Cappadocia and Bithynia, and some from Troad and possibly Caria. Now, Caria, Caria, is also called Asia in that of the King James Bible. That was the area. And lead was mined in the western Nyssa And zinc seemed to have been produced in Troad and also Mount Tolus, while various marbles of local importance were dug up. And we find that also marble was exported, as well as white marble of the territory of Sycus. The forest of pine, oak, and fir abounded in the mountains of both the north and the south. And so that was very important. Again, if they sold lumber for that shipbuilding to other places like we saw in Cyprus, they needed wood eventually because they would run out. But then you had the Black Sea coastlands. And it's kind of interesting about them because the Black Sea coast is generally steep and rocky, with an irregular line of highlands rising 6,000, 7,000 feet within 15 to 20 miles from the sea, and they have almost no coastal plain. So you had rivers of the region generally are short torrents, which do not provide access to the interior, and good harbors are few. So all of these drawbacks, plus the liability to earthquakes, tended to hold people back from any kind of progress in the area. Who would want to live in such a place? The northern seaboard of Asia Minor may be divided into two sections. That is the eastern section of the biblical Pontus and Paphlagonia. A persistent northerly wind keeps the area cool and moderately rainy throughout the entire year. But Trapeus, the capital of ancient Pontus, enjoy the weather of a Mediterranean Riviera, and that was screened as if by the Caucasus range. And so then you had the Straits of Bosphorus. The mountain of the region provided ship and carpenter timbers and deposits of silver and that of iron, and which probably gave rise in the Hittite days. And again, there's a question in reference to the Hittites, and you can find some of the information in the Botanical Encyclopedia about them. But during their days, to the earliest iron industry of the Near Asia. So the inner side of that of the mountains opened to fertile valleys, and the broad valley of the Lycus River served as a main artery for the Patonic area. And though poor harbors always were a drawback, and Sinop, at the most, the northerly point on the Black Sea coastline, did become a great maritime center. But they did have a problem because they did not build the harbors the way that the harbors should be built and kept up. The western section of the northern seaboard of Asia Minor consists of ancient Bithynia and Mysia. And here the climate is similar to that of the eastern region. So you had the mountains stand far back from the coast, leaving room for good grain and orchard country. And though they provided little mineral wealth, there are better harbors, and especially good ones, located in that area. Then you had the western Asia Minor. The western fringe of Asia Minor contributed most to the country's history in Greek and also in the Roman days. With the weather was milder, and the Greek homeland and soil that is more fertile, and the coastline is highly intricate and broken with many irregularly shaped islands. And so beginning in the north, Bosphorus is 16 miles long and averages 1 mile wide, though it narrows in places to less than 700 yards. So both banks rise steeply from the waters. And so you had the Sea of Marmara would be a natural creel for trapping shows of fish and on their animal migrations from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. And so you have the Dardanelles is 25 miles long and increase in width toward the south from 2/5 of a mile to the north of 4.5 miles on the south. Because of the evaporation of the Mediterranean, they had a flow of water from the Black Sea producing a strong current. And so the current is 3 miles an hour at Istanbul. And so you go south and along the Aegean coast, one encounters a series of broad and flat bottom east-west valleys. And they're well furnished with deposits laid by the rivers. But while this deposit makes for very productive valleys, when drained and cultivated, it also contributes to the silting up of the river mouths and that of the harbors, and that was a problem. For instance, the mouth of the Menderes is now several miles west of Roman times, the site of Miletus, once a focus of naval communication is entirely cut off from the sea, while the harbors of Ephesus is completely filled in. Matter of fact, on Ephesus, you can go and online, if I'm not mistaken, when we were doing biblical archaeology, they have some pictures of that. The silting has also created marshes with other malaria-type threats. But in biblical times, there were 4 broad river valleys in western Asia Minor: the Caicus, the Hermus, the Cester, and the Meander. Each provide access to an important hinterland. We talk about Pergamum was located on the Caicus, Smyrna on the Smyrna, Sardis, and Philadelphia. Notice again, these are some congregations in the book of Revelation had access to Hermus, and the Cester flowed north of Ephesus, and that great city Diana also tapped the trade of Meander, as did Lacedonia. So in the Roman times, the Miletus also laid on the Meander. And so these towns, western of the towns of western Asia Minor, drew material from their textile industries, from the sheep downs to that of the Phrygian tableland, with the Laodiceans known for its black wool, and Pergama for brocades and sheep hides. And so they were made into parchment, which displaced parchment as a writing material. And so the ancients of geography led to that of the development of 2 largely distinct cultures, and that of Asia Minor. While the culture of the coastal cities became largely Greek or Greco-Roman, the culture of the Plato in the interior stayed essentially Oriental. Then you have the coastlands, the Mediterranean coastlands. And so again, when we look at those, as we've already said something about them, along that entire length of the southern seaboard of Asia Minor, the mountains descend steeply into the sea, except in the regions of Pamphylia and also in eastern Cilicia. And so thus the Mediterranean coastlands enter little into ancient history. The southerly winds of the winter season brought sufficient rainfall, and so there would be a rich forest growth, which the Egyptians and many after them coveted for their timber resources. And you'd have western Cilicia was the most trackless part of the coast and became known as a pirate hideout. And so the mountains of southern Asia Minor are fold ranges and not rift valleys. In the north, you have western Taurus folds are so closely packed against the plateau that they hardly any streams cut through their way through there and through the mountains to the sea. So here the mountains have long been a serious barrier to the contact with the interior, with few roads that send into the region. So the main Taurus, reaching 12,000 feet, are much higher than the western Taurus. And because they are not as wide as the western Taurus, erosion has cut a number of narrow steep river valleys through the mountain chain. So one of those gorges has been cut by a tributary of the Cydus and forms a famous Cilician Gates, the famous Cilician Gates. And then you have Eastern Asia Minor. Eastern Asia Minor consists of serious mountain ranges in the north, all in a way into broken plateaus, and finally into an alternating plain which continues in that of northern Syria and also up into Iraq. But now we mentioned all those, and also while we're mentioning them, we're talking about the rain and things of that sort. So the climate during that time, and there are extremes that characterizes the climate. While parts of the Aegean coastlands never experience snow remains in the valleys for a third of the year in the east. And the Black Sea's coastal lands have a rainfall ranging from 25 inches in the west to 100 inches in the east, and a mean temperature of 45 degrees for January and 70 degrees for August. So the Aegean coastlands have a rainfall between 25 to 30 inches and a mean temperature of 45 degrees for January and 75 degrees in July and August. Mediterranean coastlands have a rainfall of about 30 inches and a mean of temperature of 50 degrees in January and 83 degrees in the summer. The Central Plateau had 10 to 17 inches of rainfall, and all deserts have more than 100 days of frost during the year. So the January temperature mean is 30 degrees, and the summer mean is about 70. So in the east, the climate is one of the most difficult in inhospitability in the world, with hot and dry summers and bitterly cold winters. Rainfalls average around 17 to 24 inches, and temperatures of 40 degrees below zero have been recorded in January. So you wouldn't want to go there for vacation. And then we mentioned in reference, because of all the mountainous areas and things of that sort, about rivers and the lakes. There are several rivers that we've already mentioned, but there are others that could be noted. The most important river of the peninsula is called the Kazil Irmak, ancient Halis, 600 miles long, which originates in eastern Asia Minor, flows in the Great Bend to the southwest, and finally into the Black Sea through what was Pontus. And so, unfortunately, its gorge is often too narrow to permit it to be an important means of communication into the interior. There's also the Saqqara, ancient Sangaris, 300 miles long, originating in what was ancient Phrygia, and makes a great bend to the east and flows into the Black Sea through the biblical Bithynia. And so then you had the Sestris, which is about 80 miles long, was the chief river of Pamphylia. And then the let me see this, Calacadus, about 150 miles long, drained western Cilicia. And then you had the Sidus, 40 miles long, the Saurus, 780 miles long, and the Paramus, 230 miles long, flowed through eastern Cilicia, and the latter two originated in the mountains of Cappadocia. So you had a number of rivers and so forth. And then you had also lakes, could be mentioned. The greatest lake in the area is Tata, a salt lake in the central plain, about 60 miles by 10 to 30 miles in the winter, and about nothing but mere marsh in the summer drought. You have freshwater lakes like Carlis, southwest of Pisidian Antioch on the road to Lystra, about 35 miles long. It lies about 3,770 feet in altitude. Southwest of Pisidian Antioch is Limni, 30 miles long, and so forth. And so you find that they do have rivers and lakes, even though that, and plus they would have those because of that great rainfall and stuff that they have in different places. So we'll take a break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about the government. When Paul and Barnabas came across Asia Minor in their missionary journeys, the Romans controlled the entire peninsula. And so this they had divided into 6 provinces, and so 5 of which the Senate governed, and 1 Cappadocia, the emperor governed. And so we'll look at those when we come back. 7:26, so 7:36. Y'all have a break like me.
You're back.
Yep, I got back early. I was about to die of thirst.
I don't know how you can talk so fast and so long and never take a drink. I'd be dying if I were you.
You're used to it after a while, I guess. I drink a lot at home, though. I drink a lot of tea.
I'm a water person.
All right. Well, they told me, my doctor told me that I could count my tea as my water.
Oh, is it
Yeah.
sweet? Is it sweet tea or green tea or?
Well, most time it's decaf.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, when I go to Zaxby's, they don't have decaf. But I have to have some caffeine, but don't I have a headache?
See, I count my coffee as my water for the day.
Do what?
I count my coffee as the water for the day.
How many cups do you have a day?
About 4 cups probably.
I was going to say, don't lie.
I have one.
I've gotten it down to about 3.
Yeah, sometimes when I'm at home, Linda has, well, she had half and half. I think the doctor put her on, because she has that AFib, they told her she couldn't have just half. She had to just drink decaf. So sometimes she'll make it smell real good, and I'll doctor it up and drink it. But it's, I like coffee. My problem is that I like sweet and low, and I'm not supposed to have sweet and low.
I like coffee or any of those, so I don't have a problem getting hooked on any of it.
You don't put anything in it?
I don't like coffee at all, so problem getting hooked on any of those.
Well, I went one morning to eat breakfast at the Crystal, and I said, well, today's the day. So I quit putting milk in it. And I've done it for about 2 or 3 days, and I said, well, today's the day, and I quit putting sweetener in it, and that only lasted 1 day. I started carrying my sweetener with me, so I got to go see her next week or a week after that, and I just have to tell her, I said, I might as well just quit drinking coffee if I'm not going to put, and tea too, if I'm not going to put anything in it.
Could you put honey in it?
I can, but honey just doesn't nothing sweetens like sweet and low. Nothing. No, I don't care what I use fructose. That AGAVE. I was using it, and I've been having some issues, and so I went over and looked about it, and it says that if you are metabolic syndrome X, and that's what I am, even though they treat me as a diabetic, not to use that.
Oops.
I asked my doctor, and she told me that she didn't have any information on it, but I just found this here about 3 or 4 days ago, because I ran out of it, and I didn't know whether I wanted to buy anymore, so I wanted to check it out. And so it said, no, I'm not supposed to have it, because it's supposed to be like 1.25 sweeter than sugar, something like that. But I can't tell that. But it doesn't have an aftertaste. That's what I like about it.
What about like stevia or any of those? Are you allowed to have?
Stevia?
Tastes like a plant, doesn't it?
Yes. I use it every once in a while. When I go to Zaxby's, I'll try to get off the sweet and low, and I'll use a couple of those. They have stevia's. I was over at Fayetteville, and they had some kind of stevia. And I told Linda about it, and she went and bought some, but it was in coffee, and I put it in tea at home. And I didn't like it, but in the coffee, it was sweet. But it didn't have that taste. It may have been because of the caffeine taste of the coffee. But I just, I guess you'll have to quit all of it. Just start drinking water.
It's good for you.
It's good. I know. That's what I'm drinking. But I like lemon in mine.
Oh.
Linda doesn't care for the lemon. Well, she does, but she can't have lemon.
Oh, really?
You ever try lime in water?
No, I have a friend that does that.
That gives you a little bit different taste between the two.
I might try that. I'll. Do you use real lime?
It's not bad.
You get the little squeezy thing.
Yeah.
Is that real lime, or is it like I said? I don't like the lemon. That little lemon all lemon or something like that.
So I actually use real limes, or there is also I forget what it's called. It's got the dried packet of lime and lemon. I forget who makes it, but that is true lime that's dried, and you can put that in your bottle of water and shake it, and then you'll have lime water.
Lime. Oh, I saw that when I was at the Logos training. The fella had that. It's about 50 cents. He was selling it about 50 cents.
No, they're cheaper than that. Buy them in bulk.
Well, he had a dollar pack thing there you could buy.
Yeah.
I don't know how many
Yeah.
people he ran, it was a dollar pack. So
Yeah.
that's what he paid for it. Okay. Let's see. We got down to, all right, talk about the government that we have over in Asia Minor. Now, again, we have to keep in mind when we think about the government is that they're still under Roman power. That Rome is in charge of them. But as we try to get across to everybody, the Jews, anybody could live. It's just like in America. Everybody can come here. I heard this. I think it was today that I heard this. Yeah, it was today. They were talking about it's a national day of prayer, and they're talking about how that you could come to America, and even though we different ways of worship and all that kind of stuff, but we had the freedom to do. Well, that's basically what they had to do in Rome. As long as they didn't violate the Roman law, as long as there weren't any confrontations and things of that sort, they permitted certain things. Now, that did get bad in the sense that eventually the Roman government says, no, the Caesars got to the point where they wanted to be worshipped, and so because they thought of themselves as being a god, and so that caused a lot of problems. But now we go to Asia, when, like I said earlier, there are 6 provinces there, and the Senate governed 5 of them, and then the emperor governed Cappadocia, and Cappadocia will be the last one we look at, if we get down that far. But Asia came into that the Roman Empire, and it came in by a wheel. The last king of Pergamum, who died in 133 BC. And so the Romans organized the province in 129, and by the middle of the 1st century, it had included the territories of Phrygia and Pisidia. And so the total then approximated the western third of Asia Minor. They had a proconsul that they had assisted by 3 legates, acted as a governor, and he made his headquarters at Ephesus rather than at the old capital of the city of Pergamum. And there were several free towns, as they would call them, such as Ephesus and Aphrodisia, and that ran their own government. And there were also some colonies like Alexandria, Troas, where Paul received his Macedonian call in Acts chapter 16. I forgot to highlight the passage, so I'm going to need to highlight that passage. I'll try to highlight all those for, oops. That was the wrong color. Maybe that did. Oh, well. That's the right color. Got 16 colors on it now. There you go. And in Acts chapter 16, when all the inhabitants actually considered free city status was very important because any threat to that status actually struck fear in the hearts of even the unruly, because of they looked at what happened when Demetrius, the silversmith, stirred up a mob against Paul in Ephesus. And so some 25,000 rushed into the theater and yelled and demonstrated for 2 hours in support of their goddess Diana, Acts 19, verse 34. And so finally, the city clerk was able to quiet them and to point the way of law and order. And he says this, therefore, if Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a case against anyone, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against them. Let me change something else right quick. And so then he added to the chilling warning that he gave. He says, for we are in danger of being charged with rebellion. And one version says, riot for today's uproar, there being no reason which we may give to an account for this disorderly gathering. And so with that, he was able to persuade the crowd to go home. And notice he says there, he says, we are in danger. So a city could remain free and have a right to run its own affairs only as long as it maintain law and order. And so most likely, I mean, the assumption that you would have is that just as soon as this was over, the city clerk most likely sent someone over to Rome to let them know, yes, there was an uproar, but they took care of it. And everything's just fine because, again, there would be those people who would try to stir up trouble between them and that of the Romans. So if it did not maintain law and order, Rome had a heavy hand when it comes to serious disturbances of the peace. There were the 7 cities, as we call the churches of Rome, and Asia was the jewel and the crown of the emperor. And the proconsulate was the most honorable post the Senate could prefer. Its population conservatively stood in excess of 4.6 million people. There were 7 cities of Revelation 2 to 3, chapters 2 and 3. And among them, as we stop and think about it, because again, we've mentioned Ephesus and how that we'll look at some of Ephesus and what takes place there, but there was approximately 225,000 people in Ephesus. Smyrna and Pergamum had around 200,000 each. In addition to the 7, there were other large populations like Miletus, there was 100,000, and Aphrodisias, whose stadium alone would hold 30,000 people. So the province's plentiful agricultural production and thriving commerce gave the region for the importance of the 7 churches of Asia. And then we've mentioned Cilicia after a war with the pirates. Now again, they've always had the pirates. Not only did they have the robbers on the roads, but they had the pirates on the sea. Rome pursued them to their bases in Cilicia and established a province there in 103 BC. And so gradually, Rome extended the province to include much of the southeastern corner of Asia Minor. And as the chief town of the region, Tarsus played some part of the civil wars the latter part of the 1st century BC. And apparently, Pompey and Mark Antony and Augustus all showed some favor toward the city and also that region because of that. Tarsus became a seat of learning in the east with Athenodorus and also Augustus' teacher and friend who was living there, so it became a learning place. And the granting of Roman citizenship to some of the Jews of Tarsus, including Paul's family, is thought to date back to Pompey's actions in that of the 60s. Now, again, Paul says that he was free-born. In other words, his parents were Roman citizens. Well, how did they were Jews? How did they become Roman citizens? Most likely, it was given to them. And so we're not told that. We can't go to the Bible and prove that, but that's what most people would believe, it seems. There were 6 free towns in the province, though, and some areas were governed by native kings until the Emperor Vespasian. He reconstituted the whole province in 72 AD. The governor, appointed by the Senate, resided in Tarsus. And the eastern part had fertile farmlands that produced the flax, the fruits, and the olives, and the wine, and the wheat in abundance. So it was a very fertile place. The western part of the province was still rather wild in the New Testament times, but was valued for timber resources, as we've said before about, if you build ships, you got to have timber. If you build buildings, you got to have timber. And so it was valued for that. The population of the province during the days of Paul's activities, around 900,000 people lived there. And then we have the city that we talked about, also made mention of, Pamphylia. And it was in southwest Asia Minor. And it had been established around 103 BC, and it had been linked to Cilicia in the pirate activities, with pirates disposing of their loot in her ports. And so at first, the Romans joined Pamphylia to Cilicia in a single Roman province, but they later separated it in 25 BC. Lycia on its north and the interior was joined to Pamphylia in AD 43, just before Paul's first missionary journey. So Lycia and Pamphylia each had a national assembly. So the principal towns of Pamphylia were Side, Italia, and Perga, and Aspendos, Lycia, Myra, Patara, and Xanthos. And so they had excellent harbors there. And so those played a big, important role in their prosperity. Even though being a rural province, Lycia and Pamphylia together had a population of something like 1 million in the 1st century. That's a lot of people. And also we've mentioned the city of Bithynia. We're not talking about Bithynia, Mississippi. But Bithynia in northwest Asia came into the Roman Empire around 74 BC when it was ruled by Nicomedes the fourth, bequeathed his kingdom to the Roman people. So a few years later, we find that Rome added Pontus to the province, like all the other provinces of Asia Minor except Cappadocia. Bithynia was ruled by a senatorial proconsul during the 1st century, but because of its strategic importance of the mouth of the Black Sea, the Romans converted it to an imperial province in the 2nd century. And so there were several Greek towns on the Black Sea coast, some of which were free. A few Roman colonies were founded there early in the 1st century, and Pontus had a separate provincial assembly. The municipal system was not well developed, but Bithynia probably had a population of 1 million during the 1st century. So most of its wealth came from the agricultural productions, and so it also provided high quality marble and timber. And two of the chief cities were Nicomedia, the capital, and what's the other one? Nicaea, where the Nicene Council would gather. And then also we brought up about Galatia. The Romans annexed Galatia, the interior of Asia Minor, to the Roman Empire. So we have the churches of Galatia, and that's Lystra, Iconium, Derbe, and Antioch. There's 4 of those. And so Galatia became part of the Roman Empire after the death of its king in 25 BC. And the province, when you look at all of it, included Galatia with its capital, Ancyria, and then eastern Phrygia, Pisidia, and Lycaonia. A few towns such as Antioch of Pisidia and Iconium, and had colonial rights. And urbanization was slight, and the population was small, perhaps 500,000 when Paul came through there. You had the Celts who crossed over from Europe in the 3rd century, provided its population's mucus. And so then we can read, and it gives us some information in reference to them and how they began. When we read the Galatian letter, there are some difficulties, and some people don't stop. I guess we think when he says Galatia, he says churches of Galatia, but he's talking about the different churches in the area, like Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. Then finally of all, we have Cappadocia, which is along the eastern coast eastern frontier of the Asian Minor and the eastern frontier of the empire. After its death of its king, Archelaus, in AD 17, Tiberius made it an imperial province. So much of that land had become imperial property anyway. And so there were a few towns with a population just under 1 million in the New Testament period. The Romans took over the government bureaucracy from the native kings. The governor that was chosen by them was the proculator, and appointed by the emperor, had no troops, but he could be supported by the Syrian legions if necessary. And we have to remember, we understood there were 4 of those there in that area. Vespasian, who ruled between 69 and 79 AD, he stationed troops there by the end of that New Testament period as a guard against the Parthians. And so there were problems there. And so they would take care of such problems. Again, they did not want to have problems, but when they foresaw problems, and they tried to fix it in a way that they could take care of them. And then we had in Acts chapter 13, that's Acts 13:46. I don't think that's right. Let me see. I got the passage right. Yep, that's right. Then Paul and Barnabas grew bold and said, if it was necessary that the word of God should be spoken to you first, but since you rejected it and judged yourselves unworthy of everlasting life, behold, we turn to the Gentiles. Acts 13, verse 46. So here's Paul and Barnabas, and they moved into Asia Minor, and so they went first to the Jewish people with the gospel. And probably what I would understand is that when they went in those areas, if there were synagogues, they would go there first and preach and teach the gospel. But they went to the Jews first. And as we as Bible students look at the narrative of Acts, we probably think especially about the reception of the missionaries experienced at the hands of the Jews. And so they weren't really welcomed by many of the Jewish people. But the major contest with the ruler cult and the other pagan religion also had a strong grip on the population at large. In other words, we spend a lot of time talking about, as preachers, and also when we teach from the book of Acts, we spend a lot of time talking about Judaism and the Jews, and sometimes we forget to talk about, and we usually bring them up in Acts 17, 18, and 19, but even before 17, 18, and 19, they had the problem with some of this religious cults, and not only that, but idolatry and so forth. And they had a strong grip, and especially when you read Acts chapter 19 in reference to Ephesus there, you find that, there was a big problem in reference to that of idolatry, but there was also a problem about the worship of Rome and also the emperor. And so they had to actually deal with that. And so when we look at that, then we look at the beginnings of that type of the ruler cult in the Roman Empire. And there's a lot of discussion sometimes, especially when we study the book of Revelation, that we bring up Caesar worship. And some people say, well, it wasn't that developed. Well, if you go back and you read history, and now since because we have a lot of studies in reference to biblical archaeology, that we have found that that's really not true, that we go all the way back even before AD, that they had already started some type of worship in reference to that of Augustus and others, because they have found some of the buildings and so forth, and some inscription in reference to that. So that ruler cup in the Roman Empire began during the struggle of the kingdom of Pergamum to stand up to the Seleucids of Syria. And so when Antiochus, this is around 195 BC, so we're talking about, I don't know if y'all studied, I know we offered the course. I've taught the course a couple of times elsewhere, the intertestament period. That's between Malachi and the Gospels. And so Antiochus III, Syria threatened Smyrna, and Smyrna appealed to Rome in 195 BC. Formally placed itself under Roman's protection by consecrating a temple to defile the urbs Roma, that is the city of Rome, a new cup, hitherto unknown either in Italy or in Greece. And so soon other principalities followed suit. So you had Alabanda in Caria founded a temple to the goddess Roma and established a festival in her honor. And then you had Magnesia celebrated a well, I hit something other and messed up my thing. I didn't do any better. Magnesia celebrated a festival in honor of the goddess Roma. And so with tragedies, and that's acts and so forth, comedies and farces and so forth. So Pergamum and Ephesus also established a temple to Roma early on. So here it is. So we start 195 BC, and also we see one after the other, the cities of that area began to make these temples to that of the ruler cult. Now that's 196 BC. And so the temple to the divine Domitian, 81 to 96 AD at Ephesus. And his persecution sent the Apostle John into exile on the Isle of Patmos. Most people say, I personally don't agree with that. I think it was Nero, but some people say that it was Domitian. Mr. Gibbons has those 2 volumes on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, and he says, he mentions Domitian's persecution. He says, if there were such a thing. And so he doubts there was a big persecution. Most likely, something that really bothers me is that someone comes along and quotes somebody, and then when you try to do the research of that, there's a book called Before Jerusalem Fell by a Presbyterian, and he goes and he looks, and also a couple of books by members of the church on the book of Revelation. And they say that it's circular reasoning. The people say that somebody said it was Domitian and everybody's picked it up. When, if you go back and do the research, then you find one person stated it. But again, we don't make a case of fellowship about the date of the revelation. But the point being is, even after, if we, like with me, I believe it was Nero and the destruction of Jerusalem, that he was the great persecutor. But it doesn't really matter, because even after the destruction of Jerusalem, that here it was at Domitian, we know there was a temple for him. And his persecution, like he tries to say, did a lot of damage to that of Christian people. The temple stood on a height opposite the city council's chambers, and so here in the foreground is the altar of the state cult with a foundation of Domitian's temple behind it. They have pictures of that. And so parenthetically, we need to ask why the cities of Asia could declare for a goddess, Roma, as a personification of a Roman state and didn't accept the divinity of the Roman Empire. So the answer lies in what was happening in the kingdom of Pergamum. Just before 200 BC, Attalus I of Pergamum had been honored with an annual sacrifice at Silicon, and a great statue of him was placed beside that of Apollo in the agora there. And at the same time, a priesthood of Attalus was established at Athens. So then shortly after, 188 regular deifications of the Pergamum kings took place at their death, and at Pergamum they established the worship of the living king. So you can see the progression that was taking place in reference to religious cults. So in the context of all of that, easily switched their allegiance in the Roman state in reference to worshiping that of the deities of the Roman state. What begun there spread elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean and in Rome itself. Then it was a short step from worshiping the personification of the spirit of the Roman state to worshiping her rulers. In other words, they would have that so-called statue or spirit, that type of thing. But yet, all of a sudden, they started making statues, and you can find some of those statues again on the internet in reference to these people like Augustus, all the way to Nero, Domitian, and so forth. So the cult of Augustus. Now, like I said, they began. The cult of Augustus started, and the emperor spread rapidly, beginning with the establishment of the empire. In 29 BC, Augustus permitted the inhabitants of Asia and Bithynia to set up sanctuaries in their leading cities dedicated to the cult of Roma and Julius Caesar. So their resident Roman citizenship could worship. That is, if you was a resident there, a Roman resident, you would go and worship. So it kind of sounds like Jeroboam, doesn't it? Have reference to Bethel and Dan. But at the same time, he let the Greeks of Asia set up a worship center for himself at Pergamum. Romans were not yet ready to worship the living empire, but Greeks of the East were prepared to do so. So in 26 BC, shrines for Roma and Augustus had been established at Ephesus and at Philadelphia. Now, again, Ephesus and Philadelphia are churches that are mentioned in the book of Revelation. And by 9 BC, apparently every major city in the province had an imperial sanctuary. Inscriptions have surfaced attesting to the existence of priests of Augustus in 34 cities of Asia. Now, that's interesting to understand that. Other regions of the land quickly followed the example of Asia, with the ruler cult expanding to other places in Asia Minor. Macedonia, as far away as Britain, only 6 years after the conquest of the island in AD 43. It would be tedious to detail further the advance of the emperor cult, but something must be said about its significance. And so what is the significance of this emperor cult that started? And let us give some reasons. Number one, that is first, emperor worship dominated local public life. The calendar of the cult tended to bring an order to public affairs with the special observance of days, months, and seasons. Now, we have religious groups that way today. You look in some of these cultist type groups, and you'll find they have something going on all of the time. The chief citizens in Rome and other areas would feel the priesthood of the imperial cult. And as priests, they sought to gain social and political prestige by means of service to the emperor. So they wound up building temples and other buildings, staging games and festivals and gladiator shows for public entertainment in the name of the emperor. So you can see, commonly the games and the festivals held in a community were jointly sponsored by the imperial cult and one of the other deities, for example, Diana in Ephesus, Acts 19. The cult priests also made numerous benefactions in terms of distribution of grain and oil and feasts and banquets for the less fortunate. In other words, we'll take care of the poor also. So what cities could offer their inhabitants commonly came as a result of the imperial cult. So here's the wealthy and the ambitious could find through the imperial cult a means of impressing their communities and achieving the power and the authority that they so wanted. So they were not really interested in public welfare. They were just trying to get to impress the people of their community. And this way, the emperor could gain and maintain the loyalty of his subjects and guarantee the stability of the government, not only that, but the society. Secondly, the emperor worship erected one of its chief deterrents in advance to the advance of Christianity. As we've noted, the calendar, the Roman calendar, the events of the cults and so forth, the calendar revolved around the worship of the emperor and the promotion of that of his affairs. The birthday of Augustus was a holiday. All festivals and games were held in the honor of Rome, the divine emperor, and on one or more of their pagan gods. And so the sacrifices were in honor of the emperor or one of the other gods, provided the chief source of meat, which the Council of Jerusalem forbade Christians to eat. Abstain from things offered to idols, Acts 15, verse 29. Why did they do that? It was because they were, the idols that they were being offered to basically was that of emperor worship. The feast held in the dining rooms located in the temple garden, and we're going to talk some about that when we talk about Ephesus and Diana, had a main feature, the serving of meat and other foods that were offered to that of idols. Now, there's nothing wrong in eating the meat, don't get me wrong, because again, the things in reference to that of meats and everything were already purified. A matter of fact, I think I read this last week in Mark chapter 7, in verse 18, we find that Jesus there enters the house from the people, and his disciples ask him concerning the parable that he had just given. And he says to them, and he said unto them, are ye without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatsoever thing from without entereth into the man, it cannot defile him? Because it entereth not into his heart, but into his belly, and goeth out to the drought, purging all meats. And he said, that which cometh out of man, that defileth the man. For from within, out of the heart of man, proceedeth evil thoughts, adultery, and so forth. But notice there what he said. But because he says, because he entereth not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out into the drought, purging all meats. Jesus says there was a cleansing of all meats. There was not to be like under the Jewish law anymore, because meats had been cleansed. And so here it was that these people, as we would find in reference to that, the Christians at Jerusalem, even the Council of Jerusalem, told them to abstain from that. And the reason for it is that basically you had Jewish people who had become Christians, and they had been forbidden all this time. There's nothing wrong with the meat. There's nothing wrong with people eating it. There's nothing wrong with the Christians or the Jews who had become Christians to eat it, but because of their background, they would not eat that. And so we find that they did all of these different things. The whole society was all wrapped up in this, so they came to be known as antisocial and even against as Christians, because those who tried to live as consistent Christians stayed away from all of that stuff, all the festivals, the games, the dramas, all the other social events within that religious connections. So they actually became known as antisocial and even against the good of the society as a whole. Well, they ain't going to contribute to anything. Those Christian people are not going to contribute to our society. And as they withdrew from a wide variety of social interactions, Christians could not conceal their beliefs and practice from other citizens of the country. They could not hide, and periodically mobs action targeted them. And so the mob of Demetrius, the silversmith, cited in Ephesus, is a case in point, Acts 19, 23 through 41, if you read that passage. A large part of the persecution of early Christians had nothing to do with the actions or the wishes of the ruling emperor, but arose from a local condition. And when the day came that the emperor tried to pressure everyone into the empire to engage in worship of the goddess Woman and the emperor or suffer the consequences, local people, in reference to the way they felt toward Christians, were already strong. And so public pressure proved to be a real deterrent to the acceptance of the gospel. Now, on that hand, looking at them, in other words, because we're trying to teach people the gospel, and they say, well, all this pressure from that of the Romans because of what's going on. But now also on the other end was the Jewish people, because men did not want to be circumcised. But if you want to become a Jew, you got to be circumcised. And so you had it on both sides. And we all always try to remember that it just wasn't Judaism that was trying to keep people from obeying the gospel, but it's also whatever this ruler cult was. From the very time of that as its beginning in that of Augustus before Jesus was ever born. And so then you had other pagan religions, because in Acts 13, verse 14, we find that it says, and they came to Antioch and Pisidia and went into the synagogue of the Sabbath day, and they sat down. So when Paul and Barnabas arrives in Antioch of Pisidia, they invaded a stronghold of God-men, that is one of the chief gods of the western Anatolia, and from men's home territory of Mysia, that is the northwest corner of the province of Asia we've talked about. His worship had spread throughout Asia Minor and abroad, and one of his chief worship centers stood high on a hill about 15 miles south of Antioch at the village of Sychar. And from the time when the temple was built there in the 2nd century BC, it had accumulated extensive lands and cultivated by temple slaves, as had the centers of that of the other ancient Asian deities. So, however, some of its estates were taken to people's to provide land for the Roman veterans of the legions 5 and 7 when the city was refounded, Caesarea in 25 BC after the creation of the province of Galatia. So basically, the last Galatian king had claimed the temple lands, which Augustus used for his Galatian colony, because the Romans were slow to violate existing sacred rites, but the temple was still wealthy and powerful. And the second temple we find to men stood on a hill called Kuya, and ours climb above the city of the south east. And so you had those people who would go to this synagogue, and there they would worship. Then you had the professional dancers honor the gods, and these festival honoring Sabella involved dances and dramatic presentations by dancers and actors who were more or less interchangeably as the itinerant professional dancers and instrumentalists. They put on performances appropriate to or peculiar to a given cult. Thus, they changed their act to fit each worship center they visited and made their living as professional religious actors. And so they were not local villagers or cottagers from the cottages and so forth in that area. And so they were professionals. And then you have the religious centers, which were actually cultural centers. They served with the public lectures, the parks for the zoos and the museums, the concerts, the galleries, and all the gardens and so forth. And Sabella shrines in every province of Asia Minor established and maintained those areas. And we should note also that Ephesus, the shrine of Diana, had woods that contained rare trees and provided the usual lectures and that of the concert. So worshipers invoked men to obtain healing and safety and prosperity and agricultural fertility and even the protection of the tombs. In other words, don't let any a dead spirit come. Don't let any spirit from the dead come back. So as the moon god, he would link with the underworld, and his most characteristic sign was the crescent moon, which might appear by itself or behind the god's shoulders. And so he was pictured as riding a horse or carrying a spear or a scepter, and he was regularly regarded as the king of the gods, they would call him. And even at Antioch, men in the cult of the Romans emperor and his family would dominate public religious life, and particularly as the Roman military colonists gradually assimilated into that of the local life. And so leading citizens held the priesthood of men, and therefore the temple of Roma and the imperial cult was begun soon after the accession of that of Tiberius in AD 14, and was hardly complete when Paul arrived. So a triumphant ark, they're celebrating Augustus's Pisidian victories were erected in AD 50 between Paul's first and second visit. So you can see, and we're not told in the Bible about all this other stuff going on, because the Bible is about the spread of Christianity. But when we go outside the Bible and we begin to read some of the findings that we have found, that we say archaeologists have found, then we can see that here's what's going on in the world. And so, but just because Christianity was spreading and people were obeying the gospel and yet they were being persecuted, the gospel was still being preached and people were obeying it, but yet the cults and the different religious groups were still going about doing what they were going to do. And so really to attract that of crowds and to, as we would say, whip up enthusiasm for the god and for the imperial cult, the priest periodical put on athlete contests and theatrical festivals or celebrations of some kind, and they'd go out and hire all these professional actors and dancers for that event, and plenty of money could be made from the merchants' activities that was connected with it. And I think sometimes that when we think about that, we see maybe some of these people in the religious world and the denominational world have read some of this same history that we're reading because we see some of them doing the very same thing. So you had Cybele. Now, the name of the great mother goddess of Anatolia was Cybele. And so, as we've already mentioned, considered the earth mother, the goddess of nature, of the mountains, of fertility. And so you had the attendant lines symbolize her role as goddess of the mountains, the mistress of wild nature. Then you had people believe she could excuse me, cure diseases, give oracles, and protect her people in war. And so wherever one turned in the highlands of Phrygia, there again, there's those people at Phrygia and Pentecost. There stood shrines and holy places dedicated to the worship of Cybele, lady of the wild beasts, the great Phrygian goddess, they would say. So worship of the mother goddess goes back to the early Phrygians. And her statue stood in the door of the Midas monument, 6th century BC, near Eskadar, some 30 miles west of Ankara. And earlier yet, her worship goes back to the Hittites, 1500 BC. And before, in fact, the prototype of the Phrygian Cybele was found at a place in central Turkey, dated now perhaps 6,000 BC. So that's at right after the beginning of our world, according to the way that some date our world. That our world is around not more than 10,000 years old, and some people say not more than 7,000. But there is a black stone, supposedly a meteorite, represents Cybele's throne and was brought from Asia Minor in Rome in 204 BC. In 191, she got her own temple at Palatine Hill. The cult spread from Rome to the Providence and took place in Greece and Africa and Spain and Gaul and elsewhere in Italy. Her worship was associated with forms of Artemis and Venus worship. Again, let me tell you, because of our study of biblical archaeology, you can find a lot of this stuff on pictures and everything of some of these things online. She was generally represented as enthroned in a shrine and wearing either a mural crown or a basket, carrying a libation bowl, and either flanked on by lions or bearing one in her lap, or she might be shown in a chariot drawn by lions. The annual rites of Cybele began on March the 15th. It was a procession of reed bearers. Stop and think, March 15, the Eyes of March, in memory of the Julius Caesar. A sacrifice for crops, a worshiper celebrated as a spring festival in her honor. The worshippers typically played pipes made of reeds like bagpipes with a shrill and carrying note, and to the sound of rattles and drums and shrilled pipes accompanied by their own howls and yells, and dancers wheeled about and worked themselves into a state of frenzy. Sounds like to go back to the days of the Restoration, and the people were going, and they describe in the Restoration literature about some of the meetings that they were seeing in reference to Pentecostals and things of that sort that was going on. Sounds about like the same thing. And so the various cults, though, whether Cybele or Diana at Ephesus or any other cult somewhere else, they found cult festivals to be a good business. So they drummed up support for the cults, and there were always something for sale. The festivals did what lectures on philosophy and beliefs could not, in building interest in them. And so that's what they did. Now, then you have, and let's see, we'll do this. Any questions? I don't want to start with Diana. Because we start with Diana, it's going to be long. So we're not going to start with Diana. If you let me do something right quick. Why did I do that? Told you to stop. Okay, there you go. Okay. If you look in Acts chapter 19, verse 27, it says, so not only is this trade of ours in danger of falling in disrepute, but also the temple of the great goddess Diana may be despised and her magnificence destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worship. Now, when we say that, most of the time we say, well, he's exaggerated, but he's not exaggerated when you're talking about people who worship cults. There are people throughout all the known world at that time, the Roman world, that actually worshiped the goddess Diana. And so there was some type of problem, in reference to that these people were following that of Diana. And so here it was that people were leaving. And if you read Acts 19, remember they burned all their books and things of that sort. And so that worship and what he says there is true. Okay, any questions? Let me save that. All of the things that we did.
Yeah, what about, I know we don't have any, we're not doing any more of the book, but the summary notes, because I don't have any, we're not in the book anymore.
Oh. I sent out the summary notes. Did you send? I'll send them all to you, but you don't worry about those. Just do that exam, because what we try to do here is bring in everything that we saw in the book, how they did, talked about all the customs and manners and how they work. But now we get to be able to see why that we find what's behind some of the passages in the New Testament, or we know what's behind them. And so don't worry about anything that we've gone outside the book. Just don't send me no more of those. Then I'll just mark them, as that they ceased in my grade paper. And the Excel that I got for what I call it, it's the attendance sheet with all the notes and so forth. So I just don't worry about those. And so we'll stop as long as you send me up to lesson 9. I think that's what we call up to lesson 9. And I think you've done all that. Do I?
I think I'm up to date.
Yeah, I think you are too. I got lesson 9. That's the reason why I said up to lesson 9, because we didn't cover lesson 10 or chapter 10 in the book. We just didn't cover that because it gave some brief things and it had some appendixes, and then we left that and went to the different cities that we wanted to look at. And so don't worry about that. Just do that exam. I mean, it won't take about 10 minutes to do the exam.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I tried to be nice. Most people say I've been too nice to y'all, so those of you take it. But again, let me know, Lawrence, if they say that you need a grade on that.
I will.
How they want us to give you a grade on that, since they know that we're not through until next week. So, but if they say anything like that, I can give you your last test grade as a grade, and then we'll change it for the permanent record according to what you do on the last test. Okay?
Yes, sir.
Any other questions?
Have you heard from Jumpin' Jim? Is he doing all right?
No, he told me it's going to be late. There was some type of thing he was going to, some type of graduation ceremony. He's already had his retirement thing. He had it had it Sunday. They did that Sunday, so I don't know. Matter of fact, he and his wife are going to be going to Panama, I think, in August. She may be going in sometime in May, but he's going in August, and he plans to take courses there, and hopefully he's going to get people in the congregation down there to take some courses from us and do the streaming, because he'll have the computer access.
Nice.
So as far as I know, I don't know why he didn't come on, so I hadn't heard. So he'll tell me. He'll let me know Sunday when I get all over his case for not showing up. He's a good man. He's a very good man. All right. Y'all have a good weekend.
All
You
right.
too. Thanks.
All
All right.
right. Good night.
Night.
Bye.
Oh, wait, just a minute.